Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep today into a question that sits right at the edge of our understanding of consciousness, biology, and maybe even, well, the nature of reality itself. Can human intention, focused thought, non-locally influence living matter?
That really is the fundamental question, isn't it? And it's the core topic explored in the source material for this deep dive. We've got an excerpt here from a text that really digs into this. It presents what it considers scientific evidence for something called biopsychokinesis, or bio-PK for short.
Exactly. And our mission today is really to act as your guides through the studies and the ideas laid out right here in this text. We want to pull out the most important bits of information, try to understand the findings as they're presented, and explore these often surprising ways intention is reported to interact with biological systems, even at a distance.
And it's important to stress we're exploring the landscape of this research as it's presented to us in this source. It's about understanding the claims and the studies described.
Right, so let's start with the term itself. Biopsychokinesis, bio-PK. What does the source actually define it as?
Well, as the source puts it, bio-PK is the non-local action of the human mind on organic matter and living things. And the material notes the scientific investigation into phenomena that might fall under this kind of umbrella really started gaining some traction back in the 1960s.
The 1960s, okay.
Yeah.
And according to the source, one of the earliest and maybe most serendipitous discoveries came from someone you wouldn't necessarily expect, right? Cleve Backster?
That's right, Cleve Backster. He was a CIA polygraph specialist. So someone trained in measuring physiological responses, mostly for detecting deception. Definitely not your typical biology researcher. And his initial discovery back in February 1966, it sounds like something out of, well, science fiction, but the source describes it as entirely unplanned, serendipitous.
So what happened? What was he actually doing with a polygraph hooked up to a plant in the first place?
Well, he was just watering his office plants, apparently a dragon tree, and he got curious about how long it would take for the water to travel from the roots up to the leaves. Simple curiosity. So to measure this, he attached polygraph electrodes to one of the leaves. A polygraph measures electrical resistance.
Right, and he figured more water, lower resistance, so the tracing pen should go up. Makes sense.
Precisely, that was the expectation. But after he poured the water, the curve on the polygraph tracing, it slumped. Went down. He noted that it looked strikingly similar to the kind of fear response he'd see on a human polygraph tracing, when someone was being caught in a lie or felt threatened.
Oh, okay, that's not what you'd expect from watering a plant. So that made him wonder.
It did. It made him wonder, could a plant actually have something akin to an emotional reaction,
Right.
a response to stimulus beyond just, water levels?
And that idea led straight to the now, I guess, classic threat experiment. That's pretty central to Baxter's story in this source material.
It absolutely is. He hypothesized, okay, if plants can react emotionally, maybe threatening its well-being would elicit an even stronger response. So he decided, just formed the intention in his mind, that he would burn the leaf that was attached to the electrodes.
He just thought about burning it.
Just thought about it. And what happened next, as described here, is really remarkable. The polygraph pen apparently shot upward in a sharp spike immediately after he formed that intention. This was before he'd even moved to get matches or done anything physical.
So the plant, or at least the polygraph tracing connected to it, seemed to react to his mental intent, the thought of harm, not the action itself.
That's certainly the interpretation the source presents, and it continues. When he actually returned with the lit match and brought it close to the leaf, the alarm response on the polygraph continued. It only started to normalize, to calm down gradually after he put the matches away, effectively removing the perceived threat.
Incredible. So Baxter's conclusion from this, and the source mentions many subsequent experiments.
Yes, his conclusion was that plants possess some form of primary perception, making them somehow receptive to human thoughts and intentions. He apparently spent decades exploring this phenomenon after that initial observation.
That initial discovery is quite a launch pad. But the source tells us Baxter wasn't the only one looking into this kind of thing around that time. It mentions another early researcher, a chemist named Robert Miller.
Robert Miller, yeah. His work, described here as happening around 1967, seemed to take the idea even further. It suggests not just a local effect, maybe, but a remote influence on plant life. He was doing some very precise measurements of the growth rate of rye shoots in his lab, under controlled conditions, constant light, temperature, etc.
And he had a baseline, a normal growth rate.
Extremely stable, apparently. About 0.0152 centimeters per hour under these constant conditions. Very predictable.
Okay. And then he decided to introduce this element of remote influence into this very controlled setup.
Exactly. He contacted a couple known for spiritual healing, Olga and Ambrose Worrell. They lived about 800 kilometers away, so quite a distance. He asked them if they would try to mentally influence a single rye shoot growing in his lab setup.
From 800 kilometers away, wow. How did that work?
They agreed on a specific date and time, 9 p.m. At that exact time, the Worrells would focus their intention, visualizing the specific rye shoot growing fiercely, maybe imagining it enveloped in white light, really concentrating on accelerating its growth.
So what did Miller's super precise measurement device show? What happened after 9 p.m.?
Well, his device showed the normal, stable, predictable growth pattern right up until 9 p.m. But precisely at 9 p.m., the graph tracing the growth rate started to deviate. It began angling upwards. And by 8 a.m. the following morning, the growth rate had apparently increased dramatically to 0.1344 centimeters per hour.
Wait, from 0.0152 to 0.1344.
What is that?
An increase of over 800%.
That's what the source reports, yes.
Okay.
An over 800% increase in growth rate, seemingly influenced by focused intention from hundreds of kilometers away. These early studies, Baxter's plant reactions, Miller's rye growth, they really start to paint a picture that challenges our, standard understanding of how things interact.
They certainly do. And the source mentions that Baxter's later work wasn't just limited to intact plants either.
Oh, right. He found reactions in other organic materials, too.
He did. Apparently, even cut or crushed leaves still reacted to intention. He expanded his tests to other things like eggs, yogurt, even simple smear tests taken from the roof of a person's mouth.
Smear tests, so like human cells.
Exactly. A key finding the source highlights from his later work involved oral leukocytes, basically, white blood cells collected from a person's mouth.
White blood cells. How did he test intention with those? What was the setup?
He'd take a sample of these leukocytes, place them in a test tube with electrodes attached to measure electrical potential, and he found that these cells reacted electrochemically. Their electrical potential changed when the donor of those cells experienced different emotional states.
Even when the donor wasn't anywhere near the cells?
That's the claim. Even when the donor was in a different room or different building or, according to the source, even in another country sometimes.
So a person's emotional state, or perhaps their intention, seemed to be influencing their own cells, but non-locally, at a distance. This suggests the potential effect isn't just limited to whole organisms like plants, but might operate at a much more fundamental biological level, down to the cellular level.
That's one of the really striking implications coming out of these early studies as presented here. And, researchers continue to explore this idea, looking at influencing specific cells and even simpler biological processes. The source brings in physicist William Tiller and his colleagues at this point.
Tiller, right. They're mentioned as using some kind of device to record and implement intentions, to sort of program them.
That's how the source describes it, yeah. They reportedly used a device they developed that was designed to somehow record and then implement specific intentions, aiming to non-locally affect biological processes. They ran experiments targeting very specific biological systems, for instance, human liver enzymes.
Just the enzymes themselves, not the whole cells. So you can direct intention at just the activity of an enzyme.
According to the source, yes. Their intention was specifically targeted at increasing the activity level of these human liver enzymes, which had been harvested from cells. And the reported result was pretty significant, a 30% increase in enzyme activity compared to controls.
30%. From intention alone, that's a substantial functional change at a molecular level.
It is, if accurate. Another experiment Tiller's team conducted, mentioned here, involved fly maggots.
Okay, fly maggots, what was the target there?
The intention was focused on increasing the levels of adenosine triphosphate, ATP, within the maggot cells. ATP is, the primary energy currency for all cells.
Right, cellular energy.
Yeah.
And what was the outcome for the maggots?
They measured, reportedly, a 15% increase in ATP levels in the cells of the targeted maggots. And interestingly, this apparent increase in cellular energy was associated with a measurable change in development time. The maggots with higher ATP developed faster. Their development time decreased by almost 25%.
More energy, faster development, again, seemingly influenced by remote intention. It keeps pointing towards this potential influence across different biological scales.
Mm-hmm. And going back chronologically a bit, the source revisits Jean Barry, the French doctor we mentioned earlier as an early bio-PK researcher. He was looking at fungus.
Right, trying to inhibit fungus growth with intention.
Yes, Dr. Jean Barry conducted experiments attempting to mentally inhibit the growth of a particular fungus. He grew the fungus in standard Petri dishes under carefully controlled identical conditions to ensure everything was consistent baseline-wise.
And how was the intention applied in his setup?
He had 10 participants involved. In each session, they would be presented with 10 dishes. 5 were designated as experimental dishes, and 5 were control dishes, placed about 5 feet away. The task for the participant was to focus their attention and intention for 15 minutes, specifically on those 5 experimental dishes, with the goal of inhibiting the fungus growth.
And the measurement was simply weighing the dishes at the end. Less weight equals less growth.
Correct. Lighter experimental dishes compared to the controls would indicate success, and the results reported are quite striking. Out of 195 sessions conducted, 151 showed significantly lower fungus growth in the intended-upon experimental dishes compared to the nearby controls.
151 out of 195. That's well over 3/4 of the sessions showing a significant effect. So the intention to inhibit growth seemed effective, at least as measured by weight most of the time.
That's what the data presented suggests. So you have these results accumulating: plants, enzymes, maggots, fungus. It does collectively imply that the potential for this kind of influence might be quite widespread across different types of biological systems.
It really does seem to build a case, study by study. The source then discusses psychologist William Broad and his work, I believe, at the Mind Science Foundation.
Yes, William Broad. His work explored intention's effect in other areas, too. One study mentioned here involved red blood cells, specifically visualizing the slowing down of their destruction.
Chemolysis, right, the breakdown of red blood cells. So participants tried to visualize slowing that process down.
Exactly. They were asked to visualize this process of hemolysis being inhibited, slowed down, in samples of human blood contained in test tubes. And these test tubes were located in a remote room away from the participant.
And did the visualization actually influence the rate of hemolysis?
According to the results reported here, 9 out of the 32 participants were able to significantly reduce the hemolysis rate in those remote test tubes through their visualization and intention. And the source adds an interesting detail. This effect was apparently even more pronounced when participants were working with samples of their own blood compared to donated blood.
Affecting one's own blood more effective. That's a fascinating nuance.
Yeah.
It hints at maybe a stronger connection or resonance there.
It does raise interesting questions. So we've gone from plants to cells, now to influencing complex animal physiology. The source covers studies attempting to modify animal activity directly.
Right. There was an experiment at the Institute for Parapsychology in North Carolina using anesthetized mice.
Yes, anesthetized mice. The goal here was pretty specific. Could intention influence how quickly mice recovered from anesthesia? They carefully paired mice by sex, mother, and size, 1 experimental mouse, 1 control mouse per pair. Both were anesthetized with ether. Participants were then instructed to focus their intention only on the experimental mice with the specific goal of helping them wake up faster.
Were the participants right there with the mice?
They actually ran 2 series of tests to check that. In one set, the participants were physically close to the mice but not touching them. In the second set, the participants were in a completely different room, observing the experimental mice through a one-way mirror.
Ah, so testing both proximity and remote observation. And the results. Did intention speed up waking?
The source states that the results were statistically significant in both sets of trials. The mice that received the focused intention to wake up faster did, in fact, wake up significantly faster on average than their paired control mice, whether the intender was nearby or in another room.
Accelerating recovery from anesthesia in animals.
Yeah.
From a distance. Purely through focused thought. That definitely pushes the boundary again.
It does. So if intention can potentially influence animal physiology, the logical next question is, can it influence other people's physiology? The source introduces this using the term transceiver protocol.
Transceiver protocol. Okay, what does that involve?
Basically, it describes studies where a sender directs their intention towards affecting the physiological activity of a receiver who is located some distance away. A really crucial aspect of this protocol, usually, is that the receiver is completely unaware of when the sender is actually sending the intention. They're just asked to sit calmly, relax, not try to guess anything.
Okay, so the receiver isn't consciously participating, just being measured.
Mm-hmm.
Charles Tart is mentioned as an early pioneer in this area back in the early 1960s.
Correct. Tart used this kind of protocol. In one study described, he actually acted as the transmitter himself. He was subjected to random, mild electrical shocks. The experiment aimed to see if remote receivers, people unaware of TART or the shocks, would show any physiological reaction corresponding to the moments he was shocked.
And what were they measuring on these remote, oblivious receivers?
Things like skin conductance, heart rate, and blood volume, standard psychophysiological measures.
And did they react?
The physiological data reportedly showed that the receivers did react significantly to the shocks TART received, even though they were completely oblivious consciously to what was happening to him miles away. Their bodies seemed to register the event.
So their physiology mirrored something happening to someone else far away, without their conscious mind having any clue. That's profound.
It's a profound claim, certainly, and the source notes that similar effects were apparently confirmed by other independent researchers around that time, too. It mentions Jean Barry again in France, Eric Douglas Dean at the Newark College of Engineering, and Erlander Haraldsson in Iceland. They all, separately, reported recording significant changes in things like blood volume, measured at a receiver's finger, precisely when transmitters, sometimes located thousands of kilometers away, were mentally directing specific emotional states towards them.
Consistent findings across different labs, different researchers, even vast distances, all suggesting some kind of non-local physiological linkage or influence.
That's the picture the source presents. And building on this, William Broad, whom we mentioned earlier, developed an innovative procedure he called allo-biofeedback.
Okay, I know traditional biofeedback gives you real-time information about your own body, like your heart rate, to help you control it. What does the allo part mean here?
Allo means other. So in allo-biofeedback, the physiological information being displayed, say, the receiver's skin conductance level is shown in real time to the transmitter, the person sending the intention. The idea is to give the sender immediate feedback on whether their mental effort is having any effect on the distant receiver's physiology, potentially helping them learn or refine their influence.
Ah, so the sender gets feedback on how they're doing in real time based on the receiver's body. That's clever. How is it typically used?
Many of Broad's experiments using this method focused on skin conductance, or electrodermal response. That's a good indicator of sympathetic nervous system activity, arousal, stress, anxiety levels. So the transmitter would literally watch the receiver's skin conductance fluctuating on a polygraph or computer screen. Their task was to mentally try to increase it during some periods and decrease it during others based on random instructions.
Influence periods versus control periods, randomized.
Exactly. Influence periods might be, say, 30 seconds long, alternating with control periods of no influence. The transmitter would get instructions like influence up or influence down or rest via headset while watching the receiver's live data feed.
And were these allo-biofeedback experiments successful? Did the senders seem to influence the receiver's skin conductance?
The source highlights numerous experiments conducted by Broad and his colleagues using this setup. We're talking over 300 sessions involving 62 different agents or transmitters and 270 different receivers. And these experiments, taken together, consistently indicated a significant remote mental influence on the receiver's skin conductance levels, specifically during those targeted influence periods.
That's a pretty substantial body of work with consistent findings. Did they notice anything specific about when the effect was stronger or weaker?
Well, one interesting finding mentioned comes from an experiment where the goal was specifically to reduce skin conductance. They found the reduction was more marked, more significant, in receivers who happened to start the session with an abnormally high baseline level of skin conductance.
So it was easier to calm down someone who was already physiologically aroused.
It suggests that, perhaps. Maybe the effect is more pronounced when influencing a system that's already in a state of, say, higher activation or imbalance. An interesting nuance.
And did they only find these results when using the allo-biofeedback display? Or did intention work without it too?
That's a good question. The source notes that other experiments by Broad's team, where they didn't use allo-biofeedback, also produced significant results. For example, having senders immerse themselves in emotionally charged images, or simply imagine the receiver being in a state corresponding to the intention, like calm or activated, without seeing any real-time data, apparently also worked.
So while the feedback might help the sender learn or focus, the effect itself doesn't seem to be solely dependent on it. The intention itself seems key.
That appears to be the case based on these findings, which leads us to a really impressive meta-analysis mentioned in the source, pulling together many of these physiological studies.
Right, the one by William Broad and Marilyn Schlitz, what did that cover?
They conducted a meta-analysis looking at the data up until the early 1990s. It pooled the results from 37 of their different bio-PK experiments that specifically involved measuring physiological responses in the receiver. This combined dataset included 655 experimental sessions, 153 unique transmitters, and 449 different receivers or animals. A large dataset.
And what was the bottom line? The overall statistical outcome when they combined all that data?
The source states that the combined results generated odds against chance of 100 billion to 1.
100 billion to 1. Against
Yeah.
chance, that's, well, statistically speaking, that's overwhelming. It strongly suggests something non-random was consistently happening across all those studies.
It's certainly presented as a statistically powerful case based on their cumulative data from that period. Now, building on this idea of distant influence on physiology, researchers Deborah Delanoy and Sunita Saw at the University of Edinburgh took a slightly different tack. They explored whether the receiver was consciously aware of this influence.
Okay. So distinguishing between the unconscious physiological reaction and conscious perception. How did they test that?
Precisely. In their setup, senders focused on either a deliberately induced positive emotional state, they were called specific personal positive memories, or a neutral state, just thinking about neutral objects. These sending periods, positive versus neutral, were randomly assigned. The receivers were situated in a separate room about 80 feet away. Crucially, the receivers were asked to do two things. First, consciously guess the sender's emotional state during each period. Second, their skin conductance was measured continuously, just like in broad studies.
Okay, so a direct comparison. Conscious guessing versus unconscious physiological response. What did they find? Could people consciously tell what the sender was feeling?
The analysis involving 32 sender-receiver pairs revealed that the receivers showed absolutely no special ability to consciously guess the sender's emotional state. Their guesses were essentially at chance level 50-50. However, their skin conductance levels were significantly higher during the periods when the sender was focusing on the positive emotional state compared to the neutral periods.
So even though they couldn't consciously tell the difference, their bodies reacted physiologically to the distant positive emotion.
That's exactly the interpretation Delanoy and Saw suggest based on these results. They propose that this unconscious physiological increase, the higher skin conductance, could be an index of unconscious psi reception. The effects seem to be happening below the radar of conscious awareness.
That's a really critical distinction. The body knows, even if the conscious mind doesn't. The source also mentions a study using fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, to look directly at brain activity during this kind of distant interaction, specifically distance healing.
Yes, that was work by transpersonal psychologist Jean Achterberg. She used fMRI to investigate what actually happens inside the brains of receivers when healers are sending positive intentions towards them from afar.
An fMRI study on distance healing. How is that structured? That sounds complex.
It does. They had 11 experienced healers using various different healing approaches. Importantly, these healers were often located at significant distances. The source mentions some were even in Hawaii while the receivers were being scanned, I believe, at UCSF. These 11 healers were each paired with one of 11 receivers who underwent the fMRI scans. The healers were instructed to mentally connect with their assigned receiver and send healing intention during specific timed periods while the scan was ongoing. These were alternated with control periods where no intention was sent.
Okay, so comparing brain activity during intention on versus intention off periods, what did the fMRI scans actually show in the receiver's brains?
The results, as reported in the source, showed significant differences in brain activity between the two conditions. Specifically, when the distant healers were sending intention, there was a significant increase in the level of blood oxygenation, the bold D signal, in various regions of the receiver's brains. And that blood oxygenation level is very closely linked to neuronal activity. More oxygen usually means more active neurons in that area.
So the distance intention seemed to be directly influencing brain activity patterns in the receiver.
That's the conclusion presented in the source, yes. It suggests that healers might indeed be able to connect with people non-locally and influence their brain activity in measurable ways, as detected by fMRI.
These studies collectively skin conductance, the conscious versus unconscious reception, now fMRI, they really build a multifaceted case for physiological and even neurological responses in receivers to distant intention, sometimes without awareness, and backed by some strong statistical results reported here.
It's a compelling thread running through this section of the source material.
Okay, so we've journeyed from plants and simple organisms through animal physiology and into distant influence on people's physiology and brain activity. What about going even deeper, down to the very foundation of life itself, DNA? The source actually poses the question, can intention influence DNA?
It's definitely a bold question, isn't it? Taking it right down to the molecular blueprint. The source introduces this by mentioning the HeartMath Institute and their work on what they call heart coherence.
Heart coherence, right. That's the idea that negative emotions cause chaotic heart rhythms, while calm breathing and positive emotions create a more ordered, harmonious pattern.
Exactly. A resonance between heart rhythms and breathing, which they associate with states of well-being. And biochemist Glenn Rain, who is affiliated with HeartMath, apparently connected this physiological state of heart coherence to the radical idea of influencing DNA structure.
So Rain asked, could people who achieve this high state of heart coherence actually modify the physical structure of DNA just through their intention?
That was the core question he explored, according to the source.
Now, the source briefly mentions some work at the Scripps Institute, creating semi-synthetic DNA in bacteria by adding artificial molecule pairs. Is that related to Rain's work?
The source includes that Scripps work mainly as context, I think, to show that DNA can be modified. It quotes one of the Scripps researchers, Dr. Romsberg, saying something like they could read a book written with 4 letters, the DNA bases, and invent new words by adding more artificial bases. But the source is careful to point out that the Scripps work is high-tech genetic engineering. Rain's question was fundamentally different. Could you change the existing DNA helix structure using only consciousness, intention, perhaps amplified by a state like heart coherence? No physical intervention.
Right, a non-local, non-physical influence on the molecule itself. Okay, so how was Rain's experiment actually set up to test this?
He took samples of human DNA, placental DNA, I believe, and placed them in beakers in front of the study participants. These participants had varying degrees of training in achieving heart coherence. Their task was simply to mentally try to change the DNA's helical structure specifically, to attempt to wind it or unwind it using only their focused intention while in a state of coherence.
And what was the result? Did the intention linked with heart coherence seem to affect the DNA?
Rain reportedly found a direct correlation. The higher the degree of cardiac coherence the participants were able to achieve and sustain during the experiment, the greater the measurable structural changes, the winding or unwinding observed in the DNA samples afterwards. The source also adds a fascinating note. Many participants reported intentionally generating a strong feeling of unconditional love as a way to help them achieve that state of high coherence needed for the task.
So intention combined with a specific physiological state, coherence, and maybe even a specific emotional state, unconditional love, seem to be key factors in influencing DNA structure in this particular study.
That's certainly what the results presented here suggest. And Rain also collaborated with Leonard Laskow, who is described as a medical doctor and a healer, on another study looking at intention in cancer cells.
Laskow.
Oh.
The source mentions his healing approach involves combining unconditional love, directed intention, and mental imagery, and that he'd apparently shown effects before, like slowing bacteria growth or protecting them from antibiotics.
Yes, that's the background provided. So in this specific study with Rain, they looked at inhibiting the growth of cancer cells in vitro. Rain prepared 5 petri dishes, each containing identical numbers of cultured cancer cells. Laskow then held each dish individually and applied a different specific mental intention or strategy, aiming to inhibit the growth of the cells in that dish. The growth rate was then measured objectively using a standard lab technique involving the absorption of radioactive thymidine, something cells take up when they're actively dividing and growing.
Okay, so they were systematically testing different intentional strategies to see which, if any, was most effective at slowing cancer cell growth in a lab dish. What were the different intentions Laskow used?
According to the source, after entering a state described as unconditional love, Laskow applied these 5 different intentions, 1 per dish. 1, to allow the cells to return to a state of harmony and their normal, healthy growth rhythm, sort of normalizing them. 2, to visualize that only 3 cancer cells remained in the dish, a very specific visual goal. 3, to simply let the will of God operate without Laskow formulating a specific personal intention, more of a surrender or allowance. 4, to just offer unconditional love towards the cells without any specific intention for outcome. And 5 involved visualizing dematerialization, though the source implies this one was less effective than some of the others listed based on the results.
Okay, 5 distinct approaches. And what were the results? Which intentions seem to inhibit growth the most?
The source reports some interesting differences. The most effective single strategy turned out to be intending a return to normal growth rhythm, which resulted in a 39% inhibition of growth compared to controls. Letting the will of God operate resulted in 21% inhibition. Visualizing only 3 cells remaining gave 18% inhibition. But perhaps most surprisingly, in this particular test, simply offering unconditional love without a specific accompanying intention produced 0% effect. No inhibition.
Zero effect from unconditional love alone in this context. That's notable, especially given its apparent role in the DNA coherence study and Lascau's general approach.
It is a specific finding noted in the source for this experiment. However, the source also highlights that subsequent tests where Lascaux combined strategies seem to improve the results. For example, associating the intention of a return to the natural order with the visualization of only 3 cells remaining reportedly increased the inhibition rate slightly further, to 40%.
So combining strategies, maybe carrying a conceptual intention with a concrete mental image, seemed beneficial here. It suggests the clarity and specificity of the intention matters.
That's certainly one key takeaway presented. The structure of the intention might be important. And there was a final, really striking test described in this study. Lascaux applied these same 5 intentions, but this time while holding vials of ordinary water. This treated water was then used to prepare the culture medium in which fresh batches of cancer cells were grown.
So he wasn't intending on the cells directly, but intending into the water that would later nurse the cells.
Exactly. He focused each of the 5 intentions while holding separate vials of water. Then that water was used to make the growth medium, and the source states that the water treated with the return to natural order intention yielded the best results again, leading to a significant 28% inhibition of cell growth in the cells that were grown in that specific medium.
Wow. It's as if, according to this interpretation, the water somehow stored or carried the imprint of that specific intention and then communicated it to the culture medium and subsequently to the cells growing in it.
That's the interpretation offered in the source, yes. The idea of water having memory or being structured by intention is a whole other fascinating area, but the study suggests a link.
It really does.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly now to something perhaps more universally experienced, maybe even by you listening, that uncanny sense of being stared at. The source discusses research on this very phenomenon, mentioning British biologist Rupert Sheldrake and others.
Ah, yes, the eyes in the back of your head feeling. It's very common anecdotally. Sheldrake and others have tried to investigate this scientifically using controlled experimental protocols.
Tell us about the direct observation protocol the source describes. How do they test this formally?
In these kinds of tests, it's usually quite simple. Participants are asked to guess, typically within a short time frame like 10 seconds, whether they are currently being observed by someone else, often hidden or behind them or not. This is repeated over maybe 20 trials per session, with the looking not looking periods randomized.
Okay, straightforward guessing game. And what have these studies generally found across many participants?
The source reports that across thousands of participants tested, often in schools and universities, the results are remarkably consistent. People tend to guess correctly approximately 55% of the time. Now, 55% might not sound like much compared to the 50% you'd expect by pure chance, but the source emphasizes that this small but consistent 5% bias, when accumulated over thousands and thousands of trials, becomes statistically extremely significant. It's very unlikely to be just luck.
A small effect, but reliably above chance. And it mentions training can improve results.
It does note that repeated testing or specific training seems to help some individuals significantly improve their accuracy on this task.
Okay, what about the other type of protocol mentioned where the observer and the observed person are physically separated, not in the same room? How does that work?
Right, that protocol started being used more in the 1980s. Here, the participants are in different rooms, maybe connected by closed-circuit TV, maybe not even that. And instead of asking the observed person to consciously guess if they're being watched, researchers typically record their physiology, usually skin conductance again. The observer in the other room is randomly instructed by a computer or signal to either look intently at the receiver's image or just think about them, or look away and think of something completely different during specific timed periods.
And did the receiver's skin conductance change depending on whether the remote observer was looking at them or not?
According to the source, numerous studies using the separated observer-observed protocol have yielded significant results. They consistently show that the skin conductance in the observed person tends to change, usually increase slightly, during the periods when the remote observer is looking at them, even if the observed person has no conscious idea when that's happening.
So again, it's like that unconscious physiological detection of attention we saw earlier. but specifically for being looked at.
Exactly. It seems to be a physiological response to non-local attention or observation. And Dean Radin, mentioned before, explored a variant of this using an electrogastrogram, or EGG, measuring gut activity.
Gut activity. Why the gut?
Because our gastrointestinal system is known to be very sensitive to emotional states. Radin wanted to see if the observer's emotional state, while looking at the receiver, could influence the receiver's gut activity non-locally. So the setup involved the observer watching a TV screen showing the receiver's live image, but also periodically viewing short video clips designed to evoke strong, positive, negative, or neutral emotions. Meanwhile, the receiver was relaxing in a different shielded room, having their EGG measured.
And did the observer's remote emotions actually influence the receiver's gut contractions?
The results reported were significant. The EGG responses in the receiver were significantly greater, more gut activity, during the times when the distant observer was experiencing the positive and negative emotional states, compared to when the observer was in the neutral state.
Wow. So the observer's feelings, directed towards the receiver's image, seemed to create a measurable ripple in the receiver's gut activity from afar. That's a pretty visceral connection.
It certainly suggests a deep, perhaps unconscious level of connection. And rounding this out, the source mentions a meta-analysis by Stefan Schmidt and colleagues at the University Clinic of Freiburg in Germany. They specifically reviewed studies on this non-local effect on skin conductance and the sense of being stared at.
What did Schmidt's meta-analysis conclude?
It analyzed around 30 relevant studies available at the time. The overall statistical analysis confirmed the existence of these phenomena, the physiological response to remote staring as being statistically significant, not just chance. And perhaps just as importantly, his analysis revealed a fascinating correlation. The magnitude of the effect observed across the different studies was positively correlated with the methodological quality of those studies.
Meaning the better designed, more rigorous studies actually showed a stronger effect.
That's what the correlation suggested, yes. Which argues against the idea that these effects are just artifacts of sloppy research. If anything, better methods seem to reveal the phenomenon more clearly.
That's a very important point for assessing the reliability of these findings. Okay, now let's move to what is arguably one of the most compelling and potentially impactful applications of these non-local effects: the idea of distance healing. The source starts this section with a really powerful medical anecdote.
It is a truly striking story. It takes place in 1975. An English trainee doctor suddenly became critically ill with something called Waterhouse-Friderichsen syndrome. It's a devastating, rapidly progressing bacterial infection causing acute adrenal failure, often fatal. She was admitted to the hospital, essentially dying. She was also hemorrhaging in her left eye, and the prognosis was permanent blindness in that eye, even if she somehow survived. A truly dire situation.
Absolutely terrifying. What happened next?
That same evening, apparently unknown to each other initially, several separate groups of individuals who knew her gathered and prayed intensely for her complete healing. And the source notes that at the very same moment later that night, corresponding to when these prayer groups were active, her condition in the hospital suddenly and dramatically began to improve. Doctors were reportedly astonished, noting things like her pneumonia seemingly vanishing from x-rays almost overnight.
A sudden turnaround coinciding with the prayers and the outcome for her.
She came out of the coma 4 days later. She regained perfect sight in her left eye against all expectations. And ultimately, she made a full recovery, returning to perfect health.
That anecdote is incredibly powerful. It inevitably raises that fundamental question. Can prayer or focused healing intention directed towards others really heal at a distance?
It certainly frames the question vividly. The source then moves into the scientific investigation of this, highlighting the work of psychiatrist and researcher Elisabeth Targ.
Elisabeth Targ, right. She conducted studies specifically on distance healing for advanced AIDS patients at the University of California, San Francisco, UCSF, in the mid-1990s. Tell us about those.
Yes, the source describes a pilot study first, in 1995. It involved 20 patients, all receiving the standard conventional medical care available at the time for advanced AIDS. 10 of these patients were randomly assigned to also receive prayers from distant healers. These healers were located, on average, 2,400 kilometers away, and crucially, they were blinded. They didn't know the identities of the patients they were praying for, only that they were part of the study. This went on for 6 months.
Okay, small pilot study, but double-blind in terms of the healers. What were the results after 6 months?
The source reports that during the 6 months of the pilot study, 4 patients died. which was sadly not unusual given the state of treatment then. However, all 4 deaths occurred in the control group, the group not receiving the distance prayers. In the experimental group, the 10 patients who received the prayers all were still alive at the 6-month mark.
Wow. 0 deaths versus 4 deaths. That's an incredibly strong signal for a pilot study, albeit small.
It was certainly encouraging enough that Targ and her colleagues conducted a larger, more rigorous confirmatory study starting in 1996. This time, they recruited 40 patients with advanced AIDS. These patients knew they had a 1 in 2 chance of receiving prayer, and they were carefully randomized, balancing factors like age, immune system status, CD4 counts, and existing complications. Photos of the 20 patients assigned to the experimental group were sent to 40 experienced healers from diverse backgrounds: rabbis, Christian healers, shamans, bioenergy practitioners, etc. Photos of the control group were locked away. The healers were instructed to perform their specific healing rituals or prayers for 1 hour per day, 6 days a week, for a period of 10 weeks. They rotated through the list of experimental patients weekly.
Okay, a larger randomized trial with diverse healers. What were the outcomes measured in this confirmatory study after 6 months?
The results reported were again quite significant. Over the 6-month follow-up period, the patients in the experimental group, the ones who received distance healing intention, spent 600% fewer days in the hospital compared to the control group. They also suffered 300% fewer new AIDS-related illnesses, things like serious ulcers or encephalitis. These differences were statistically significant.
6 times fewer hospital days, 3 times fewer illnesses. Those are major clinical differences. But what about the placebo effect? The patients knew they might be getting prayed for. Could that explain it?
That's a critical question, and the source addresses it directly. They apparently surveyed the patients afterwards. It turned out that about 55% of patients in both the experimental group and the control group believed they had been prayed for. But crucially, the source states that those who believed they were receiving prayer didn't report feeling subjectively better or show better outcomes than those who didn't believe, regardless of which group they were actually in. This suggests that the significant health improvements observed in the prayed-for group were likely not simply a result of a conscious placebo effect based on their belief alone. Something else seemed to be going on.
That helps disentangle the potential mechanisms, suggesting a direct effect beyond just belief. Though the source does rightly acknowledge that replicating prayer and healing studies consistently can be very challenging, doesn't it?
It does. It points out that not all studies on prayer show such clear-cut results, often due to methodological shortcomings, difficulty in standardizing the treatment, the prayer or intention itself, and especially the challenge of controlling for the variable effectiveness of the senders, their ability to actually generate and direct intent effectively.
Right. The quality of the intention seems crucial but hard to measure.
Yeah.
This actually brings us back to Dean Radin and a study the source calls the Love Study. He was specifically investigating if training could modulate the effectiveness of distance healing intention.
Exactly. Radin wanted to see if specific training in compassionate meditation could enhance the effects of distance healing intention. His study involved couples, where one partner was healthy, they acted as the sender, and the other partner had chronic illness, specifically cancer, they were the receiver.
Okay, couples dealing with cancer. How were the groups structured?
There were 3 main groups. A trained group, where the healthy sender partner received specific meditation training focused on compassion. A waitlisted group, which consisted of similar couples tested before they received any training, serving as a baseline. And a control group of healthy couples without illness. The training itself involved a 1-day workshop, plus instructions for 30 minutes of daily practice for 3 months. The focus was explicitly on developing compassionate intent, described in the source as cultivating an act of selfless love for another person with the specific intention to relieve their suffering and increase their well-being.
So train specifically in compassionate intent. How was the actual distance healing effect tested in the lab?
Both partners, sender and receiver, were equipped with electrodes to monitor their physiology continuously: skin conductance, heart rate, respiration. They were asked to try and maintain a feeling of connection with each other. The receiver was placed in a comfortable, electromagnetically shielded, isolated room. The sender was in a separate room, about 65 feet away. The sender watched a video monitor which would randomly display the receiver's live image for brief periods, around 10 seconds. During these periods, the sender was instructed to focus their compassionate intention towards the receiver. When the image disappeared for random intervals of 45 seconds, they were told to relax. The receiver, importantly, was unaware of this timing.
Okay, so measuring both partners' physiology during randomly timed periods of focus, compassionate intent versus rest. What did the physiological data show? Particularly, how did the receivers respond?
Well, first, in the senders, their skin conductance consistently increased shortly after the receiver's image appeared, which makes sense. It reflects the mental effort and activation involved in focusing intention. Now, for the receivers, all groups of receivers showed a prompt physiological response in skin conductance right when the sending period began. Their bodies registered something immediately. However, the pattern of that response differed significantly between the groups. In the control group, healthy couples, the response peaked quickly and then faded after about 4 seconds. In the waitlisted group, untrained couples with illness, it lasted slightly longer, fading after about 5 seconds. But in the trained group, where the sender had undergone the compassionate intent meditation training, the receiver's skin conductance response increased more gradually, kept increasing for about 8 seconds, and showed the highest overall increases compared to the other groups. The effect was sustained longer and was stronger.
So the specific training and compassionate intent for the sender seemed to directly enhance and prolong the receiver's physiological response to that remote intention.
That's precisely the conclusion presented in the source. The meditation training, specifically focused on cultivating compassionate intent, appeared to measurably enhance the effects of that compassionate remote healing intention, at least as measured by the receiver's autonomic nervous system response.
That study, like others discussed here, really underscores the potential importance not just of intention itself, but perhaps the quality, the emotional resonance, or the specific focus of that intention being sent.
It seems to point in that direction, yes. The nuances matter.
Okay, we have really covered a vast and, frankly, mind-bending range of investigations here, all based on the material presented in this source. We started with the subtle electrical responses of plants like Baxter's dragon tree, moved to single-cell organisms like leukocytes and fungus, then influencing the wake-up time of an anesthetized animal.
Then affecting the physiological states, skin conductance, blood volume, even gut activity and brain scans of distant people, sometimes completely outside their conscious awareness.
Right, then down to potentially influencing the very structure of DNA linked to heart coherence, and attempting to inhibit the growth of cancer cells in lab dishes, even seeming to change the properties of water used for cell cultures.
And finally, circling back to that common intuitive feeling of being stared at, showing it might have a measurable physiological basis even across rooms or via video monitors.
It is a truly remarkable spectrum of phenomena explored in this source text, and all of it points towards this central, controversial idea: the potential for human intention, consciousness itself, to exert some kind of non-local influence on living systems across vastly different scales of biological organization.
And the source presents these not just as possibilities, but as findings supported by, in many cases, statistically significant results from controlled experiments, alongside compelling anecdotes. It definitely pushes the boundaries of our conventional, strictly local, physical, touch-only understanding of connection and influence.
Absolutely. And for you, the listener, engaging with this deep dive, exploring this material as it's laid out here, it's really about gaining a potentially broader perspective. These findings, as presented, offer maybe a new lens, a different way to consider the nature of consciousness, our potential interconnectedness, and perhaps even the subtle factors that might contribute to well-being or affect biological processes in ways we are only just beginning to explore scientifically.
It certainly invites us to consider that perhaps interaction isn't always limited to physical proximity or the forces we currently understand well. It opens the door to the possibility that consciousness itself might play a more fundamental, active role in connecting with and influencing the living world than is currently accepted in mainstream science.
It's a profound shift in perspective, potentially. So, drawing on all these threads, here's a final thought for you to ponder, something sparked by the implications of the studies described in our source material today. If intention, if focused thought, if even specific emotional states like compassion can reportedly influence biological processes, DNA, cells, animals, and even other people at a distance, what does that truly imply about the depth of our interconnectedness?
What might it suggest about the latent power residing in our own conscious focus, our attention, our emotional states, or even about the fundamental nature of reality itself? Is it more participatory than we assume?
And looking inward, what other biological processes, perhaps happening within your own body right now, might be susceptible to these kinds of non-local influences from yourself or maybe even from others in ways we haven't yet fully recognized or learned how to measure?